No, I just hit the button to go live though.
Nice.
Hey guys, Dave from Nerdarchy, for nerds by nerds, and today I'm hanging out with Craig Campbell of Nerdburger. You guys make games, podcasts. You're all over the place. You got a couple games out, and I was looking at your credits. You've worked on quite a few of them that our audience is going to be familiar with. You've worked on Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder and Gamma World, to name a few. How are you today?
I am great. I've been looking forward to this all week, Dave. Is Dave, David? Do you
I answered either. Dave's fine.
Alrighty. Yeah, I've been looking forward to this all week, mostly because this is my first day of vacation for the holiday. So I knew I had the day off, and I actually talked like an hour ago. I talked to a guy at Roll20 about maybe getting some of my game stuff onto Roll20, and after we're done with this, I'm taking the manuscript for the game that I'm working on right now to the editor. Like it's done. It's going to the editor now. So,
and that's Capers.
Yes, and that's the game's called Capers. Yeah, but we'll get around to that.
I suspect because they're going to come out soon. They pretty much always do, and that is the Fantasy Grounds college folks, right? And then since you've already brought up virtual tabletop, they're going to start asking you about Fantasy Grounds.
Sure.
They are aggressively helpful is the best way.
I'll take aggressively helpful over disinterested but nice.
And they're always about trying to get all the things on Fantasy Grounds, and they are no way, shape, are they connected to Fantasy Grounds? They're all like volunteers.
Sure.
So they just love what they do. So you do a weekly podcast, and we were talking a little bit before we went on air, and you've been doing that for the past, like, you're going on 5 years now, right?
Yeah, it'll be 5 years in March.
Ooh, congratulations. That's a long time to do a thing.
Every single week, new episode every Wednesday for every single week for going on 5 years. I remember I've had the discussion with my podcast partner, Mike. When we first started, I said, make sure you number them with triple digits. Like, first episode should be 001. And he said, are you kidding me? You think we're going to make it into triple digits? And here we are, well into the 200s. 249, I think we record tomorrow.
That'll teach them the doubt.
Yeah, it's called the Nerdburger Show. It's at nerdburgershow.com. It's like, what you and I are doing right here. But just a straight audio podcast. It's geeky, nerdy discussion about all manner of things. We hit on like news items, and then and then some longer topics, bigger topics where we delve into different things every week. It's a little different. We have a guest on with us most every week. Usually the guests are just a rotating group of like friends of ours. But everybody, each guest has like their own particular kind of sense of humor and their own particular interest, so it rotates around. And then occasionally we get other name people on there. I mean, I've had Rob Schwalb on the show, and Jason Bowman a couple of times, and a handful of other people that we just get lucky and say, hey, you want to come on the show and talk about geek stuff?
That's usually enough. A lot of times when I'll invite a guest on, they're like, what are we going to talk about? I'm like, I don't know, we'll figure something out. Like, literally, you get a couple of gamers together, a couple of nerds together talking about this stuff, and an hour goes by in no time.
Yeah, half an hour later, you're neck deep into discussing the Marvel Cinematic Universe and don't even realize that the time has gone by. Yep.
Absolutely. So we were talking a little bit, and a lot of your gaming right now is playtesting. And I would say there's two different versions, like playtesting your games, actually, and then research.
Yeah, that's true. The research mostly happened early on, and then once I started designing, the first thing you do is, at least for me, is I would get it in front of just some friends, like just give it a run, see if it has legs, see if the system seems to make sense. Your friends are mostly going to be nice, they're going to say, hey, this is really cool, Craig, and they're being supportive, and that's good. But then eventually, I try to put the game in front of strangers and people that don't know me, don't know the system, that are coming in cold. And when I did Murders and Acquisitions, which is the previous game that published last year, I had a tough time finding playtesters because I was nobody. So most of my playtesters were like, oh, I have a friend in another city, and they've got a group, and I don't know anybody in that group. so they won't, they won't pull punches. So that's what, that's kind of what I did the first time around. And then once I funded the Kickstarter for Murders and Acquisitions and published that, now I had like a little bit of a fan base. And so I went to them and said, hey, I've got another game. Does anybody want to play test it? So I actually had, whole groups of complete strangers that had not, had not play tested the first time around with the first game, but play tested Capers. And, and some of those groups were there through the whole thing. They play tested all year long. Multiple rounds of playtesting. So that's a lot of work. Just like I try to get it, play the game and run the game myself and get it in front of people so that I can see it in action. But then just managing playtest groups when it's just you, that's rough. It's like I would spend a month. I'd give them the playtest materials, okay, and say, okay, you've got a month and get back to me. And then I would be writing content and researching and developing new stuff. And then they'd give it back to me. And then I'd take about a month to assimilate all of that information, make adjustments to the game, prepare new playtest materials, and, lather, rinse, repeat every 2 months for the whole year.
So what I'm hearing as advice to a new game designer, start off with at least one friend that's a dick.
Well, I do have friends who, they offered useful criticism. But it's always one of those things where they'll couch it nicely, where they'll just say, okay, I think this thing could use a little tweaking. It's not quite as good as it could be. What do you think? And then I had the rude awakening of I had a playtest group that for the first playtest, they recorded themselves playtesting it. And the playtest lead came back to me and said, if you'd like to listen to it, you can. You can listen to us play the game and then also discuss it afterwards. And before we fill out the surveys. And I said, okay, sure, why not? And I listened to him play, and I was like, okay, well, there's a couple of things they're not quite getting right the way I kind of intended in the rules. So that was informative because it means that, the rules are not clear. But then they got to the discussion at the end, and there was one guy who offered great criticism, but was kind of a dick. And if that guy's listening, or if any of the people in that group are listening, the playtest lead admitted this to me. He's like, we don't pull punches, and so he had some very critical things to say, but they were useful things, even if they were kind of, blatant and just like, without tact at the moment. Yeah. Well, and he was just he was hanging out with his friends, and he was talking to his friends the way he talks to his friends. And then this third party comes in and listens to him and goes, oh man, that hurt my feelings a little bit. But it all worked out okay. They continued to playtest. I didn't dump them or anything.
Oh my God. We need the video of Craig. Craig listens to playtesters and cries into his beer.
Maybe.
No, it's good. You know what though? Like, when I listen to you talk and I'm watching people, comment in the chat, like, hey, I would like to play test new stuff. I would like to play test new stuff. Maybe there's a need. Maybe someone needs to organize those people that want to play test stuff so that indie RPG designers can like tap into them and be like, here's some stuff and make it easier.
And there's no like central repository for that, like if you want to play online, there's a couple of services where you can do that and you can find players, and there's groups and Google groups and Facebook groups and everything that are built around these things. But I don't know that there's like, I don't think I've seen an organized group somewhere that it's just like, oh, nothing but playtesters show up here. People just looking to playtest something. I think everybody who's designing something tends to find their groups the way they find them. And then sometimes they might share them. If if I know so-and-so game designer is looking for playtesters, I might point him to some people that have playtested for me, or, that type of thing. But yeah, if you want to take a point on that and put together a little website and everybody can come in, sign up and be on newsletters to find people to playtest.
It so happens we do have a website.
Hey.
But no, I was just thinking about it and also there's probably a value to, like, I'm sure you can find places where other game designers collect, right? And you can connect with them. But I just wonder if there wouldn't be a benefit to just getting GMs and players that have no desire to really become designers. They just play the game
Yeah.
Maybe that, is that feedback going to be different?
You get different feedback from different people, certainly. If it's somebody that's done a little bit of freelancing or, has a little bit of design experience, um, versus people who are GMs regularly versus people who are players regularly, and then different types of players, very serious players who like really crunchy games, and then you get, game players that are just looking for the fun factor. Does this game have a fun factor? If it does, I'm cool. So yeah, I mean, I've seen very specific, like I can usually, I'm at the point now where if I get some feedback on a game, I can probably guess whether the person is primarily a player or primarily a GM or who has done some game design, based on what kind of feedback they come back. Because the designer will come back with like talking about the guts and make suggestions. The GM will talk about the technicalities of running the game, and the player will talk about just doing character stuff, or they tend to do that.
And I'm sure they all have different levels of value as well when you're going back through and reevaluating your game. Like, for instance, like when you got to actually, and when you got to listen to them play and go, oh, they misunderstand this one part. It has to be clearer. Yeah. I've also heard from, I have quite a few friends that are board game designers and tabletop designers, and they're like, the rules is the hardest part. Writing the rule book for people.
Oh yeah. Getting the game to be understood. Like I can sit down in front of a group of people at a convention and explain the rules in 5 minutes, and we can get going and play. But to give them a game book where they're going to say, okay, I'm going to read it. I'm going to start here, and I'm going to learn this thing, and I'm going to learn that thing, and I'm going to learn that thing, and I'm going to learn these 3 things before I learn this other thing down here. Otherwise, I'm going to get confused and having to present all of that. And when I was playtesting, what I did was halfway through the playtest run, I brought in brand new playtest groups. I brought in completely fresh eyes, because at that point I had a much more well-developed manuscript for the whole game. Basically, the rules were written; they just needed to be tweaked. And so I brought brand new playtesters in, and their first round of playtesting was asking questions like, "Is this all clear? Is there anything that you had to read twice or 3 times to understand? Did you have to flip back to reference other things, or did it all kind of stick?" And so I took that whole route on it too, where there's you as a designer get too close to the game and you miss things that might, like I know how this thing works, but I'm not describing it clearly, and I'm not noticing that I'm describing it improperly. And then playtesters who have been playing the game for a while start to fill in the gaps as well. So the fresh set of eyes is always useful to find, like, oh, there's this giant gap here. There's a leap of logic that's not described, and it makes this whole chapter hard to understand, that type of thing.
So since we've kind of talked a little bit about game design and playtesting now, how about we go into the actual games themselves? First, murder and acquisition.
Murders and acquisitions, yes. That's a sort of it's a game all about beating people up in an office. It's about scrapping and clawing your way to the corner office, to the top of the corporate ladder, by whatever means necessary. So it's a little bit of kind of fantasy wish fulfillment for anybody who's ever worked in an office or had a crappy boss or a shitty coworker. So you can pretend to beat them up or throw them down the elevator shaft or whatever. The game is steeped in just kind of absurd humor. It's very tongue-in-cheek, a lot of hyperbole. There's little corporate jokes written into the game here and there. And then the base game is set in the modern day, and it's kind of that in this over-the-top corporate world where everybody's really extra violent. And then there's a bunch of add-on chapters where you can take more fantastic elements and weave them in there. So, for example, for people who like, I want my role-playing game with magic and monsters. Well, you can put magic and monsters into the game, and now there's spellcasters at the company, and there might be a monster on the board of directors, and it becomes like an urban fantasy.
Your boss is a real dragon lady.
Yep, definitely. Or the vampire marketer who works really weird hours.
Sounds like fun. It almost makes me think of any meme I've ever seen with like fantasy creatures playing a role-playing game. So did this come about through your personal
I get asked that question.
Stories?
Actually, it came from a coworker, not one who was being a dick, but just the guy who had an idea. He's like pitched this idea for a game like where you're clawing your way up the corporate ladder and you're kind of backstabbing other people and blah blah blah. And what he was describing felt a little bit like you could reskin Munchkin to do that, where how you fight monsters, but you also screw with each other. So in the corporate game, you're going after your bosses or whatever, and you're also screwing with each other. But I'm a role-playing game guy. I'd been doing freelancing for several years, and so I took the idea and ran with it. With his blessing, he said, "Hey, yeah, I'm never going to do anything with it." It was just a neat idea that he had, and so that turned into Murders and Acquisitions. And it took a little while to develop it. I was working on it probably start to finish to the point where it got published was a little over 3 years. Mostly because I couldn't find playtesters very easily, so that kind of stretched things out. I could only move as fast as I could playtest. But I decided when I started working on it, I'm just going to let it. It's going to take as long as it takes, and so that's what I did.
And guys, as always, there is tons of links in the description, links to find Craig's products, links to find the podcast, to stalk Craig throughout the interwebs. And if you have questions, as always, just put the word question before it so I can find it. Somebody just said in the chat here, made a reference to Paranoia, the game where the computer wants you to be happy. Actually, in Murders and Acquisitions, there are several backdrop companies that you can set your story at this company, and they all have different themes to them. And there's one company that is called Super Happy Megacorp, that is literally like an homage to Paranoia, in that they use subliminal messaging and drugs and everything to keep their employees complacent and happy. And so if you're playing, characters at that company, you're probably, not taking your happy pills in order to be able to continue functioning. So Kenyatta has an interesting question. Mm-hmm. And did you work with a professional designer, or did you do the final editing development yourself? Do you feel like the developer contributed? If you did work with one, you've done a bunch of previous work in the industry. Yeah, I freelanced a bunch primarily for Wizards of the Coast, and so I kind of know what the difference between designer and developer is, but I think it's one of those things that's a little different at every company. It's just how their process works. I did all the design, although I hired some people to write some parts for both games that I've worked on, and I've basically done the development. But what happened, like with Murders and Acquisitions, for example, I got Chris Sims, who you may know the name. He's worked for Wizards. He's worked. He's freelance for a ton of people, and he's got a lot of experience in development and editing. And he gave the whole rule set for Murders and Acquisitions a technical edit pass, where he went into not so much about copy editing and capitalizing and punctuation and spelling, but he went through and said, okay, the information is being presented in the correct order now. I've moved some things around. I'm introducing this thing first, then this thing. I'm making sure that it all flows so that a reader is going to go through the rule set and kind of build their knowledge of the rules in the right way. And he definitely brought a lot to it. He helped. He confirmed some things that I thought I was a little shaky on. He confirmed some things that I was happy that I got right, and he made some changes that I think made the book read better. So one of the tricky things I find about tabletop RPGs, especially when you leave D&D, right, is the group dynamic. There's just certain genres just lend themselves to a group dynamic. It's kind of been established, like superhero teams is a thing. D&D is its own genre at this point, and the adventuring party is its own thing. But when you get away from that, it becomes a little trickier. So how do you navigate those waters? Sorry, I was looking at the chat a little bit too. Could you just sum up what you just asked? No worries. I suck. I get lost there sometimes as well. The group dynamic, how does that work at the table for Murders and Acquisitions? Okay, sure. The idea being, it's a cooperative RPG.
like many, like most of them are. Yeah, there's games that go PvP kind of stuff where you can backstab each other, but that's always part of the social contract of the group, right? Is like, do you play super cooperatively, or is it fair game to kind of go after the other characters? Murders and Acquisitions, the idea is that the characters are all really out for themselves, but they need someone to watch their back in order to, not get ambushed and to be able to get to the top. So that's the, you form your party, so to speak, your team, out of necessity, because, the strength in numbers, and somebody's kind of keeping an eye out for you. Now, that said, you can certainly, backstab each other and go after each other. And there's actually, you could take it completely that direction and, just let the dice fall where they may. And there's actually an optional set of rules in there called intra-party conflict, where you can choose to use this rule set where each game session, each player chooses another character in the group that they hate and another character in the group that they like, and then everybody else they're indifferent to at that time. And there's little mechanical things that can happen based on like if the person that you secretly hate right now fails horrendously at something, you can benefit from that.
It's funny. The last comment that just popped up in the chat is, anyone else thinking Office Space the game?
Absolutely. I've described this as, it's Office Space, but what if Peter and the guys beat the crap out of Lumberg rather than the fax machine?
That's a great definition.
I've also had people describe it as Office Space Grand Theft Auto Office Space Edition. And there's been a couple other, people have come up with some clever ways to describe it. Yeah, Battle Royale. There you go.
Now the game's been out, you've had tons of play testers. What are some of the best stories that have come back to you?
I've only had a handful of stories come back to me, so my best stories are probably when I'm running the game myself at a convention or something.
All encompassing.
Okay, I was at a convention down here in Atlanta, and I had it was just 1 hour demos, like, pull up a chair, sit down, I'll teach you the game, we'll play for an hour. And I had a mom and her 2 kids, a boy and a girl, who were like maybe 10 and 12. And before I got started, I said, I took the mom kind of aside and said, the game can, describe, like, beating people up and all this kind of stuff. And she said, don't worry about it. These two play video games all the time. It's like, you just describe what you're going to describe. So we're playing the game, and there's one point where the girl, the daughter is, they get into a fight in an alleyway, and the daughter's going to throw something at one of the adversaries. And I said, okay, and she's saying she's going to throw it. And I just kind of made some stupid assumption on my part. And it's like, are you looking to knock him out? And she's all, no, I'm going to put it through him. A little, 10-year-old girl was like, woo, yee.
Like, look out there, Spike.
Look out, future dates.
Do you want to knock him out? No, I want to impale him with this trash can. I'm like, I don't even know how that works, but okay.
And there's one game where a friend of mine, his character got pulled inside of, there's in the Magic and Monster kind of version of the game, there's an animated dumpster, like a trash dumpster. You can, it's basically a mimic, but it's a trash dumpster, like a big, the big green one. And his character got pulled inside along with, like he was preparing a Molotov cocktail. And he had it lit, and then he got pulled inside the dumpster with the lit Molotov cocktail, and things went poorly.
Nice. So you don't actually have to answer this question, but I'm just going to throw it out there. Mr. Tarask has a new YouTube channel, and he's got really good content over there. He would like to review Capers. So there's information in the description, Twitter, website, that kind of stuff. You can reach out to Craig. So you can answer that one or not answer it. Is fine. I hate to put people on the spot. sometimes the chat gets a little ornery, and they try and ask like business decisions and questions during the live chat. I'm like, that's probably better. That's
okay.
Channel.
You got some contact information. Anybody who wants to to take a look at the game, to review it. You know, it is available. There's a preview edition of Capers right now that's available at Drive-Thru RPG. It's just a few bucks. It's actually $2 till the end of the year for the PDF. And it's the slimmest version of the game that you can make. It's like, here's the rules, here's some powers for your 1920s gangsters with superpowers, and here's some pre-generated characters and an adventure. And then down the road, that'll be, you know, if all goes well with a Kickstarter next year, that'll get expanded into, you know, 150, 160 pages with more complete information and a lot more options.
Well, since we've now invoked the beast known as Capers, why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a superpowered game of 1920s gangsters. So think, you know, Boardwalk Empire or The Untouchables or, you know, pretty much any movie with Jimmy Cagney in it. And just, you know, slap superpowers on some of those characters. And they're kind of like street level, not super duper powers. You know, there's no characters that are threatening to destroy the world. But there's characters that can run really fast and characters that can, you know, mess with your emotions, and people that can bend a Tommy gun in half with their bare hands. And they're, you know, you're playing gangsters who are out to enjoy that lifestyle and make your fortune in the world of prohibition and gambling and racketeering and prostitution and all that fun stuff. But your rivals have some superpowered folks with, you know, that you're running up against, and the law enforcement, the feds, do as well. So you run into a fair bit of superpower shootouts and things like that.
Oh, I totally missed that part. The notion that you're actually the gangsters.
Yeah. I've come to realize that I don't write games about heroes. There's nothing heroic about any of the characters. Although technically with Capers, you can, if you wish, play. The information is there for you to play law enforcement. You can play Department of Justice agents and sheriffs and constables and cops and whatnot, and you can fight that losing battle because they don't ever really get much done against the groundswell of organized crime that comes out of prohibition.
So Kenyatta has a question that is mechanic based. Did you go with a solidly defined power system or a power stunts RP heavy power system?
I guess you'd say it's fairly solidly defined. It's basically each power has a standard effect. So like if you use the power, this is the thing it does. But then each one has a series of boosts that go with it, which is like boosts are things that augment that standard effect, or, you know, twist it or kind of make it work a little differently. Or sometimes there are things that are unrelated to the actual standard effect, but that are kind of in the purview of what the power is about. Like if you've got a concussion beam power, you can increase your range with a boost. You can up your damage with a boost. You can make it a blast, so it does an area effect with a boost. Or you can also, you know, shoot the beams at the ground and propel yourself up with a super jump. So there's a number of things that you can do, and every time you take a level in a power, you gain more boosts. You know, you start out with a few and you gain more as you go. And so the powers can range. Some of them you just take the power one time, you've got this thing. Some of them you get there's, you know, levels to the power, so you're getting better and better with the power. You're becoming more versatile.
So, all right. So we have a question, and also I was going to ask.
It is amazing, Mr. Tarask. It is.
It does sound like a lot of fun, and like I said, we had actually had an idea for a similar campaign style, and that would be fun to play whether you're playing from the gangsters or the cops or whatever. Just a different twist on it. So, Murder's Acquisition and Capers, you are using the same engine on that?
They're different. Murders and Acquisitions uses a fairly straightforward dice system. It's you've got a skill die that's, you know, anywhere from a D4 to a D12, and you roll that along with a D6 that's called the synergy die in the game, and you add those two together, you compare it to a target number. And then there's some more nuance to that, where you can be rolling additional synergy dice, or you can be bumping your die types up and down based on circumstances. But otherwise very straightforward. Capers uses playing cards. Every player and the GM has a deck of playing cards with jokers included. And you are flipping cards to determine whether you're successful at things. And the way it works is the pip value, or well, let's count back. Based on what you're trying to do, you'll have a certain number of cards to flip, anywhere between like 1 and 5. And you, whatever that number is referred to as your card count. So let's say I have a card count of 3, which is kind of middling. You'll flip up to 3 cards, and you can stop at any time and take that card. But the way it works is that the pip value, like 2, 3, 4, all the way up to ace high, determines success versus failure. So you might need an 8 to succeed. You might need a jack or better to succeed. And then the suit determines the degree of success or failure. And it starts with clubs being the worst, alphabetically up to spades. Spades is always the best possible result. So you might flip a king of clubs. King is almost certainly successful, but clubs is going to be barely successful, and it's going to come with a complication of some sort. So you gamble and you flip another card. Now you might get a good card that gets you a bet, still succeeds with better success, or you might fail. And so you can be flipping cards. So you're kind of it's a press your luck strategy kind of game where you're deciding, okay, am I going to flip one more card? I found it to be very engaging at the table. Players like to watch other people and tell them what to do. Or remind them, oh, you've got a lot of kings and aces left in your deck, man. You flipped a lot of low cards. Keep going, man. Because you can kind of count cards as you're doing it too. You can pay attention to what's left in your deck.
And that's actually one of the questions where Freginator asked in the chat. And you're going to find out who you want at your poker table or who you want at your blackjack table and not.
A little bit. But it's been a fun system to design because it's different. It's a little out of the ordinary, and it's something I hadn't done before, so it was exciting and interesting and new. And it's been fun at the table because it is it's an engaging system. I've had playtesters tell me that, where it's like you normally, like when you roll dice, sometimes it's just you roll a die, you look at the number, success or fail. Then you roll your damage or not, or whatever. Whereas with the cards, you're making active choices. Every time you flip a card, you're thinking, okay, what am I going to do? Am I going to flip another one? And then there's ways that you can spend points called Moxie that get you another card. So if you really need to save your bacon, you can try one more time and do different things with the Moxie as well. That's a pool of points that goes up and down as you play.
Yeah, I was looking at one of your. I was checking it out, and I saw the cards too, and I'm like, it wasn't all clicking right away. Retro Kung Fu has a question. What's the most difficult part about getting a game over to a group? Like, what is your go-to sales pitch?
Oh, to getting like the playtest group? Is that?
I guess getting a new game to a group. Maybe in general.
Okay. Well, for getting playtesters, it was just it was like spray the water with the bullets. Just hope. Just put the offer out there to a bunch of different people and then see who responds. And I actually had it kind of like I got like a dozen people that were saying, hey, yeah, my group will play test. And then I sent some stuff to them, and I only got back like 4 or 5 groups that came back to me with information. And so, and then over time they become like regular groups. They were playtesting all the time. They were reliable because they weren't just talking out their butts when they said, yeah, I'd like to play test, and then they never get back to you. As far as finding people in a group, just like to sit down and play, a new game. Let's say it's just, you want to get people to play D&D, swing a dead cat. You want to get people to play a little indie game or your game or whatever. It's, I think the best sales pitch is probably to define maybe the 3 features of the game that make it the most interesting to you. Because if you're going to be involved in this, maybe you're running the game. Those are the things that you're going to focus on. So you want players that are going to be into those things. So, if the playing card mechanic or a weird dice mechanic is really intriguing to you, don't downplay that because, they're going to have to deal with the mechanics. But if it's, tell them what's cool about the story, what's cool about a character that you can play. Don't necessarily bore them with stories of your character. But, you can certainly, yes, just pitch like the top 2 or 3 things. And if they immediately start asking questions, then you've got them hooked. And if they go, oh, that's okay, that's cool, then they're probably not interested in playing.
So completely different mechanics. So when you decided to make the games, like it sounds like the first one is like someone threw an idea out there and you really like the idea.
Mm-hmm.
So are you trying to match the mechanics to the game you want to run? Or do you come up with the game you want to run and just figure out mechanics?
Well, Murders and Acquisitions, I went with the dice thing, and I kept it simple for ease of design on my part, because this is the first time I was doing something like that. And I thought, okay, I don't want to do the D20 thing because everybody's done that. I wanted to actually design a system of my own, and I didn't want to get too robust and big and like too many dice, because I just never get the thing play tested, and I'd never be done. So I kept it simple. With Capers, I briefly considered just kind of taking the Murders and Acquisitions dice system and using that, maybe tweaking some things, and starting to develop my system, the Nerdburger Games dice system. But I started toying around with ideas, and I thought, well, what about using playing cards? Because like Deadlands uses playing cards for some of its mechanics, and it's appropriate because it's the Old West and poker.
Did you look at Dawn Commander Phoenix? Or is it Commander Dawn Phoenix?
I know of it, but I did not look at it. And so I toyed around with the idea of like, well, what if I use playing cards, and what are the different ways you can use them? And I hit on this idea of the press your luck kind of thing. And I tried it out one year at a little convention. At the end of the local convention, I just sat down with a few people and said, hey, let's try this thing out for 2 or 3 hours and just see what it looks like. And they were intrigued by it, and I thought it had legs, and I just kind of started developing from there. So I think with Capers, definitely, yeah, I took the, since the 1920s is very much about prohibition, but there's also a lot of gambling. You can envision characters in gambling dens and in casinos. So yeah, I kind of built a game mechanic that would help you kind of feel that a little bit.
Flavor. So the mechanic was more like flavor. So was there any internal dialogue or discussion when you're thinking about using cards of, is it going to be random or is it going to be resource management?
Is what going to be random or resource management? You skipped a little. I was trying to put it together in context.
No, that's okay. Cards. By using cards, it really does give you an option of going resource management versus random.
Yeah, it's like when your deck is fresh, it's random. And the longer you keep flipping cards out of that deck before reshuffling, which does happen in the game, it goes from being about random to being more about resource management. Because now you're thinking about like, what do I have left in my deck? Have I blown through that good? There's two jokers. One's a good joker and one's a bad joker. Have I run into that bad joker? Because every time I flip a card, I'm getting closer and closer to that huge botch that's coming. Maybe I want to try to see if we can't get the deck shuffled before we hit that. It's an interesting mechanic, I think, in terms of how it changes. It starts out purely random. Like that first card flip, you could get any card. And then after that, once you've seen some of your kings, queens, and aces fly through, then you're starting to worry like, oh man, I got to be careful about how often I do stuff. And hopefully we'll have a moment in the game where the GM calls for a shuffle and I'll be able to get some of those cards back. And then you've got a point system that's all resource management as well.
Okay, so it combines it a little bit. Mm-hmm. What would make a GM call for a reshuffle?
Basically, it's a little bit GM fiat when it comes to that, but the guidelines are in the game where it kind of talks about after like a major combat encounter where you've really blown through a lot of cards, or after a series of shorter encounters, and then there's also a way. One of the things you can do with Moxie is you can spend a Moxie to reshuffle your deck on your own. You can choose to do it. It'll just cost you one of those points. So if you know that you've blown through a lot of your good cards and the GM isn't calling for a shuffle, you can spend a Moxie and say, okay, I'm getting my good cards back into my deck.
So Mr. Taras wanted to know about, in the system, is it designed for the unpredictability of superpowers?
Is it the unpredictability? There's a bit of unpredictability to it just because of the random element. It's really not like the superpowers themselves. There's not like, like if you do something wrong, you'll blow up the world or blow up yourself or blow up your friend or do anything kind of too overtly weird or crazy or game breaking. I think that answers the question. I'm not.
Yeah, I think so too. But I think because this game,
your powers are pretty reliable. Like if I've got a character that has these two powers at this level, these are the things you can do.
And I think it's more. I think the way you answered the first time was more of what he was getting at, in my opinion. Because when you have a supers game compared to other genres, usually there's such a wider breadth of what the characters can do, and you never know what a player is going to come up with for a use for one of those powers.
Right.
But because it's more like street level, lower tier, there's a limiting factor on how crazy they can get.
Yeah, the game does not have a Professor X. There's no mind control. There's no magnetism control. There's no character that's going to be utterly indestructible. There's no character that's going to kill anybody with one punch. That's just not in the game. I toyed with the idea of mind control for a while, and I thought, what it comes down to is players love having a character that can mind control the bad guys, but they hate that power the minute their character is mind controlled.
Yeah.
And so I just said, you know what, screw it. It's one of those things that's going to take agency away from the players. This world just doesn't have it.
Do you look at problems like that and then try and like solve them with the lore?
I try to make sure that the handful of powers that affect your character outside of damage, like that can make your character do stuff, are limited in the scope that they influence you in some way, but you still have a choice in what you're doing. You just have to be true to what it is that's affecting you. Or if there is a real ongoing condition, there's a way for you to resist it. You get a chance to shrug it off every so often, so you're not necessarily stuck with it. Like you don't walk into the fight and immediately become mind controlled to beat up on your friend, and that's all you do for the rest of the fight. Gee, that's fun. And there's games that do that, and there's games that build that in, and it's just not it's not my cup of tea. Not something I'm going to design into the game.
And that actually came up in our Marvel game the other night. And my character was the one that was mind controlled. Like, I got a private message from the GM. It's like, you're mind control. You have to attack your allies. I'm like, excellent. I picked the weakest one, and I'm like, I want to try and impale him with the sword that just mind controlled me. I actually, as a player, I kind of like that stuff a little bit. And like, character death and stuff like that is just part of the game. So I'm like, whatever. But like, if you give me the reins and say you are now the bad guy as the player and you have no control over it, then I go all out, because how often you get to do that? Whatever happens. Chances are you're the one that's really going to get killed anyway, because the party is going to have to, jump on you and try and stop you. But there's definitely some fun stuff to that.
Yeah, no, there's nothing wrong with it in game. It's just I was like, I'm just not gonna. There's plenty of other cool, interesting things we can do with these powers. I'm not gonna put any of the powers in there that really F with you.
And I actually got like a saving throw or a chance to resist every round. I was just rolling horribly.
Well, that's how that always goes, right?
Yeah, the dice know. On the plus side, though, for my fellow players, I was rolling horribly as well. I think. It was Marvel, so it's percentile dice, and I don't think I rolled above like a 35. I was like, so depressing. I was going to hurt somebody. So Geek and Undies, Capers, out of question, curiosity, is there or will there be rules for gadgeteering, creating diesel punk power armor or advanced weaponry, or War of the Worlds-esque aliens with their ray guns?
Oh, this sounds like somebody who knows the game already. Yes, there is both of those things. Is this somebody I know? Here's what I did. There's a chapter in the game that comes after the powers that includes rules for essentially super cool gear, like powered gear. So you can be the Iron Man version, the 1920s Iron Man. And the way it really works is, it's not too different. It's still powers. It's just tied to gear. So there's a slight tweak to the rules and how they function. There's a little bit of an upside and a little bit of a downside, and you have to have the gear in order to be able to do what you're trying to do. So yes, you can do that. There's rules in the game for playing a non-powered character. You can just have extra cool skills and be really highly trained. So you can play the Batman or the Punisher in the 1920s. And then there's a section, the last chapter in the book is called the GM Toolbox, and that was written by James Introcaso, who was on your show a couple days ago. And that includes James is a he's a comic book guy. He knows his way around comics. So I had him take a handful of your classic comic book tropes and create like the capers versions of them. So like, okay, you're in this world with gangsters and mid-tier superpowers, but now you also have alternate Earths. So you can travel the multiverse to other places. And one of the alternate Earths is called Omega Earth. And it's World War I took place. What they called the Great War. It happened, but it wasn't between countries. It was between humanity and aliens, a la War of the Worlds. Like, telepathic flying saucer aliens with ray guns. And they came down and we won. But the world has been devastated by that war rather than World War I.
Well, and I imagine that also changes things because you introduce all these higher level technologies into the game.
Yeah, a little bit. There's laser laser guns, laser whip, like a laser whip. There's flying cars that will take you 100 feet above the ground. It's got a little bit of a Buck Rogers bent to it. It feels a little bit more like that. It's not super high tech. It's like what people in the 20s thought the future would be like. If you've ever seen illustrations of those types of things, it's that.
That's all. Well, that's so much more fun. Anyway, so that being said, like we've talked a lot about the mechanics and what to expect. What about like the overarching story or lore for capers?
Well, the game is set in the 20s. I do not specify a year. On purpose, because I want you to be able to use anything that you know of from the 20s is there. So if you want this particular car to have been invented, okay, it happened recently. That's fine. I don't need, we don't need to do the history lesson of, whether or not this thing was invented yet, because there's a lot of modern conveniences that we take for granted that are actually very, very new in the 1920s. And the game book, the setting section of the book describes all of that stuff, helps to set the stage so you get a sense of what's new technology in this world, what's new advancements, what's new in entertainment, what's all those types of things. So it sets the world. And then there's a number of backdrop cities that are written up where you can set your game in these cities, and you can make up something if you want to as well, but you could play it, you have your game set in Atlantic City or in New York or in Chicago. And there's some of those personalities from the era that we all know, Al Capone and Lucky Luciano and so forth. They're in the game. Some of them have superpowers. But I've also taken the opportunity to twist a few things, because if you know the Prohibition personalities, that the bulk of them are like white dudes in their 20s and 30s. And that's a pretty narrow demographic of interesting characters to read about and look at. So, I flipped some things around. Like Lucky Luciano is not Charles Luciano, it's Carla Luciano. And she's a, tough as nails, right-hand woman to Arnold Rothstein, who's kind of the bigwig in New York. And she has earned her nickname Lucky with a superpower that makes her lucky. And things like that. So, and I introduced all sorts of other characters. There's, a pretty wide variety, different people of color. I'm not dropping N-bombs in the game. I'm not, dropping horrible, verbiage for racism and misogyny and homophobia and everything. It's like, it's a little bit more of an ideal world. Let's not worry about that stuff. Let's just play with superpowers and gangsters.
No, I totally get it. And it makes sense. It makes sense, especially if you want more people to play your game. So
well, I wanted to appeal to everybody. Yeah. I want to be able to have like, a, Filipino lesbian sit down and say, hey, there's a character like me right there.
And, from the other standpoint, there's nothing wrong with re-envisioning a history the way you would have rather have it been than the way it was. Yes. After all, this is a game for escapism, and that's why we play role-playing games. So
absolutely,
there's nothing wrong with making it more idyllic.
And if you want to, at your table with your group, play a game that deals with racism, in the 1920s. You can do that. You know what racism is. I don't need to bake it into the game.
Right.
You can have a deep dive in addition to the escapism and the superpowers and pew pew pew. You can have a deep dive. You can explore themes and human things like that, but you don't need me to bake it into the game for something that's essentially a superpower game.
Absolutely. So I'm definitely intrigued. I definitely want to check it out. And I'm fairly certain I'm positive I've not played any RPGs that did not rely on dice as of yet.
Well, you're going to have fun with this because it's a very different mechanic. Takes a little bit of getting used to, but once because when you roll a die, you're looking at the number, right? That's the one thing you're looking at. Whereas when you're flipping the cards, you kind of need to pay attention to the suit and the pip value. So you might see like a kind of a middle pip value, like, oh, it's only an 8. But it's spades, and spades is really good. And so if an 8 is successful, that spades is really cool. And so you kind of have to, it takes a few times through to kind of get to grasp that. But once you do, it makes a lot of sense. And
the first thing I thought of when you started explaining the mechanics of the game is Lemmy from Motorhead started singing Ace of Spades in my head.
Well, Ace of Spades is always a great card in the game. So Lemmy would approve because that's one of the best cards to flip. That's like the second best. The best card to flip is the Good Joker. But the Ace of Spades is right up there.
Where does the Suicide King fall into the things?
Which one's the Suicide King? Diamonds?
It might be hard.
It's the one that's always illustrated with the sword through his head, right? Where he's holding the sword behind him. I'd have to go look to see which one that's going to be, because in the game, ultimately there will be a deck of playing cards that you can get as well. That'll be Capers themed. And if the Kickstarter goes well in March, the face cards will get illustrations of NPCs. And each suit is going to be split to Atlantic City, New York, Chicago, and then one of the suits will be prominent law enforcement figures. So I got to figure out, because I've assigned the suits to the different groups, but I don't remember for sure what I'd have to check to see who's going to be the Suicide King.
So AJ Kinney has a question. Can you give a summary of how the suits affect the game? We already know clubs is the worst and aces and spades is the best.
Right. Well, clubs is the worst, spades is the best. So if you succeed and you get spades, you get a boon. So you do the thing better. You get some extra little perk. If you succeed and you get clubs, you succeed, but there's a complication. So the GM will invent like some sort of little problem that you also have to deal with now. If it's hearts or diamonds, it's just a success, straight up. If you fail with spades, you fail, but you get what's called in the game encouragement or motivation. It's called motivation. You get a free moxie point, but you have to use it next turn or you lose it. So you get like a little something to help. And then if you fail with clubs, it's a botch and something bad happens. And if you get the bad joker, it's a super botch.
Super botch. No.
Yeah. Yeah, you fail at what you're doing, you botch, and your turn ends immediately.
Sweet. And we can look for that March next year?
The Kickstarter for the full book, fully illustrated and everything, will be in color. Is going to start on Tuesday, March 6th next year. The Capers preview edition, it's black and white, but it will ultimately be in color. The preview is just black and white. You can get that at Drive-Thru RPG right now. There's a soft cover. It's like a 44-page book. The soft cover is like $10. The PDF is normally $4. It's on sale for $2 until the end of the year. And you can also check out Murders and Acquisitions there. All of that's on sale right now till the end of the year. The PDF is like $3 off, and all the book versions are $5 off. And I just put another game up there that's in a rudimentary stage. It's a very short little preview edition that you can just try out and maybe provide some feedback for a game called Die Laughing, which is a horror comedy game where everybody is portraying characters in a horror comedy movie, and everybody's going to die. It's just a question of when and how funny it is. And that's up there for like a couple bucks.
Die Laughing. I love it.
Just try.
Horror comedy game. Has anyone done that, like, for tabletop RPGs?
There are I think there's been little ones here and there by little indie producers that have done some things. This is a GM-less game, so everybody's playing a character that's going to die, and even after your character dies, there are rules in the game that keep you involved, and it plays out in just an hour or two for one story. So it's a very quick kind of turnover. It's very narrative heavy. The dice mechanic is basically a pool of d6s that will decrease as you go, and when you run out of dice, your character dies. But then you have other things you can do. You can mess with the other players.
That makes me think of a recent video we did on the DM player character. And first of all, like our group and Nerdarchy as a philosophy as a whole, we don't actually care how people play their games if you're having fun, whatever. But we, since we have a platform, we get to tell you how we like to play our games.
Sure.
And what's wrong at our table. I guess is more specific. And we did kind of a rant on the DM player character, and hundreds of people showed up to explain to us why they absolutely need a DM player character at their table. But this might be the perfect game for them since there's no GM.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's structured. I say there's no GM, but really what it is you're sharing the GM responsibilities. As you play through scenes in the movie, there's a different lead character every time, and the player to that person's right is the director. So they help to set the stage for that particular scene. And the book comes with it. It describes, like, there's a whole series of scenes, and you determine what the scenes are randomly, and you just kind of improvise it through. And then there's a little bit of dice rolling, and eventually you run out of dice. So everybody gets, it's actually kind of, I've had people say, it's kind of a neat way to introduce somebody to the idea of GMing. It's like, okay, you're going to do some GMing, but just a little bit.
So it sounds like fun. So of all the products or projects you worked on, what's your favorite that's not one of your games that you've recently created?
I would say, like, if we're going back to the Freelance library, probably the one I like the most, that I'm most proud of, just because of the size of the thing, was I wrote a adventure for Dungeon Magazine called Baba Yaga's Dancing Hut. It's an enormous 31,000 word adventure, and keeping in mind that most of those dungeon adventures during 4th edition were 15 to 20,000 words. 31,000 words, full. Every room of all 48 or whatever rooms in the hut are mapped. It's a very complex kind of beast. It's huge. It's like, I want to say it's like 50 or 60 pages long. But that was a real challenge, and I'm very proud of it.
That got a call out and shout out the other day when James was on.
Oh, did he?
Yes.
When did he mention that? Did I miss that?
I'm pretty sure it was him, unless maybe it wasn't James.
Because he knows I wrote that. But anyway, yeah, it's I know I've run into a few people who say that my version is their favorite version of Baba Yaga's hut. So that's always nice to hear. Even
that's definitely
a whole edition later. Yeah. It's a cool adventure. It's more of like an exploration thing. Like, there's all sorts of things going on in the hut. There's not one clear-cut goal. You explore the hut. No mosh hard. 48 rooms doesn't sound like a hut. It's a tesseract. It's a 4th dimensional cube. Every room connects to 6 other rooms.
Yeah, absolutely.
On each side, on the top.
Sean Merwin or James Intercosta.
I'm sorry?
It was either Sean Merwin or James Intercosta. I had them back on the show back to back.
Oh, right, yeah. It might have been Sean. He might have mentioned something. I'm honestly not sure. But extra dimensional hut. Yep, that's what it was, Fraginator.
Nice. It sounds like a beast to work on as well.
It was a lot of work. Yeah, I worked on that thing like just constantly for a month and a half.
You also worked on Gamma World.
Yeah.
4th edition, like I said. I guess we were talking about that just before we started, and that was a very fun iteration of the 4E rules, where maybe I wasn't loving it as a D&D game, but I definitely enjoyed it for the Gamma World. It just totally worked.
Absolutely. You know how the writing for that started was, I just wrote 2 things that were on the website. They were free. They weren't part of any subscription service. But what happened was, I got the Gamma World game and I read it, And there's a point in the game where they're discussing the world and how there's all these alternate realities. And one of them, and they remark that the town of Peshtigo, Wisconsin was nuked, I think, by the French in all but one reality. Peshtigo, Wisconsin is my hometown. That's where I grew up. So I contacted the people at Wizards. I was already doing some freelance stuff, and I said, "Hey, who wrote this Peshtigo bit?" And I think it was Bruce Cordell, if I remember correctly. Thinking back on that, he just heard the name of the town and thought it was funny, thought it was a cool name, so he included it. And so then I wrote an article that was all about translating your hometown into a setting for Gamma World, and had random tables to help you do that and all that sort of stuff. And then I wrote another thing called Pedal to the Metal, co-wrote that with a friend of mine, which is all about vehicles, where you could, trick out your vehicles, make a Mad Max style death machine.
The last character I played in it was Ghost Rider. He was a wheeled ectoplasm. So I made a guy in a wheelchair.
I played an irradiated cat called Rad Cat, and he zipped around on a skateboard.
Oh, nice. That's awesome. There's just so much fun stuff to do with that. And they also had that the random generator online. It's still out there somewhere, that you can find and use and just make wacky and crazy combinations.
It's a fun game. I've got it. I made sure that, like when we wrapped up playing it, I got all the stuff and all the cards and the supplement books and everything, put them all in the box. And I'm like, it's right over there. I can look right at it. One of these days I'm going to bust it out again, because I made sure to, I didn't lose the cards and that kind of stuff. I've got all the pieces.
My partner was playing, he was playing Gary the Funganoid Regenerator. And the story behind Gary was basically he's a Mike and Ed that was living in a game store in the basement. And so he discovers all the stuff and starts the Church of Gygax. So there's just a lot of ridiculous fun things. But with that, we were at the hour mark. Like I said, it always goes
no.
So we're gonna have to wrap it up. Some parting words?
Yeah. Play a lot of games. Try other stuff. D&D's great. Don't get me wrong. I enjoy it. But there's a lot of really great indie stuff out there. Just dig around Drive-Thru RPG. Pose questions at Eon World or whatever your gaming forum of choice is. Yeah, try them out. There's all sorts of cool stuff.
That there are words to live by. I absolutely agree. I want to thank you for coming on, Craig. Really appreciate you spending some time with us today. And thank you for everyone in the chat hanging out. So until next time, guys, stay nerdy.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.